He thought she was invisible, just another poor employee who barely mattered. But when a cold-hearted billionaire followed her during lunch break and saw her feeding disabled and homeless people with her own empty hands, something inside him cracked. What he did next didn't just change her life, it made her fall to her knees in tears. The city never truly slept. Even during lunch hour, horns screamed, people rushed past each other, and glass buildings reflected lives that never seemed to slow down. Inside one of those buildings sat the headquarters of a powerful corporation, led by a man whose name alone commanded fear and respect, Alexander Blackwood. Alexander was known for many things: ruthless, brilliant, cold. He had built his empire from nothing, and somewhere along the way, his heart had turned to stone. Employees feared his sharp eyes more than deadlines. To him, people were numbers, productivity charts, and profit margins. Weakness disgusted him. And then there was Emily Carter. Emily worked quietly in the accounting department. She earned barely enough to survive, lived in a tiny rented room, and wore the same worn-out coat every winter. She never complained, never asked for favors. She arrived early, left late, and kept her head down. To Alexander, she was forgettable,
Weak.
replaceable. She lacks ambition, he once muttered after seeing her file a report. People like her never rise. Every day at exactly 12:30 p.m., Emily left the building with a small paper bag. No phone, no coffee, no chatter with coworkers. Alexander noticed this pattern one afternoon while standing near the glass windows of his office. "Does she ever socialize?" he asked his assistant casually. The assistant shrugged. "Not really, sir. She usually eats outside." Alexander scoffed. "Probably can't afford lunch." That should have been the end of it. But that day, something strange happened. Alexander had an important deal fall through. Furious, restless, and unable to sit still, he decided to leave the building to clear his mind. As he stepped outside, he saw Emily walking ahead, her small frame disappearing into the crowd. On impulse, one he didn't understand, he followed her. At a distance, Emily walked far beyond the cafes and food trucks, far beyond the clean sidewalks. She turned into a quieter street, where the shine of the city faded and the cracks in society showed their faces. Alexander slowed. What is she doing here, he thought. She stopped near an old park, its benches broken, its grass dry and forgotten. That's when he saw them. Disabled men in worn wheelchairs, a blind elderly woman holding a stick, and a few homeless souls huddled together like the world had forgotten their names. Emily knelt down. She opened her paper bag. Inside were simple meals, sandwiches wrapped carefully, fruit, bottled water. Nothing fancy. Nothing expensive. "Mr. James, I brought your favor today," she said gently, handing a sandwich to a man missing a leg. His face lit up. "God bless you, child." She smiled, not the polite office smile, but something real, something warm. Alexander froze. She moved to the blind woman, helping her open a bottle of water. "Eat slowly, okay? I'll sit with you." Then she fed a young man whose hands trembled uncontrollably, patiently wiping crumbs from his shirt like a sister would. Alexander felt his chest tighten. These were her lunches. Every day. She wasn't eating. She was giving. He watched from behind a tree, ashamed of himself for spying, yet unable to look away. Emily laughed softly at something one of them said. Her laughter didn't belong to the harsh world he knew. It was pure. After the food was gone, she didn't leave. She stayed. She listened. One man began to cry quietly. "My family stopped visiting," he whispered. Emily held his hand. "You're not alone. I promise." Alexander felt something unfamiliar crawl up his throat. Why would someone with so little give so much? As Emily stood to leave, the man in the wheelchair asked, "Did you eat today, dear?" She hesitated, then smiled. "I'll eat later."
She lied.
Alexander knew it. She walked away, unaware of the man in a tailored suit standing in the shadows, his beliefs cracking like glass under pressure. He followed her again the next day. And the day after. Every lunch break.
Rain. Cold. Heat.
Emily never missed a day. One afternoon, as she fed them, a man suddenly shouted angrily, "Why do you keep helping us? What do you get from this?" Emily's smile faded, just for a second. "My little brother was disabled," she said softly. "When my parents died, people stopped helping us. He starved, not just for food, but for kindness." Her voice trembled. "I promised myself I'd never walk past suffering again." Alexander stepped back, his heart pounding. That night, he couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in his mind. For the first time in years, Alexander questioned himself. All his wealth, all his power, and yet, he had never fed a hungry person with his own hands. The next day, he made a decision, one that would change both their lives forever. But Emily had no idea. And when that decision finally reached her, she would break down in tears. Emily returned to the office that afternoon unaware that the world she thought was fixed and unchangeable had already begun to shift. She sat at her small desk, quietly typing numbers into spreadsheets, her stomach empty, but her heart full. Across the building, behind thick glass walls, Alexander Blackwood stood motionless in his office, staring down at the street below, not seeing cars or people, but seeing her. For the first time in years, work felt meaningless to him. That night, Alexander drove himself home instead of letting his driver take the wheel. The city lights blurred past him, but his mind replayed one image again and again. Emily kneeling on cracked concrete, feeding disabled strangers with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from sacrifice. "How long has she been doing this?" he murmured to himself. The next morning, he called Human Resources. "Tell me about Emily Carter," he said flatly. The HR manager hesitated. "She's quiet, sir. Good performance. No complaints. Family? She lives alone. Parents deceased. Brother passed away several years ago." Alexander closed his eyes. Everything she said was true. From that day on, Alexander began watching her, not with judgment, but with curiosity. He noticed how she gave up her chair to others, how she apologized even when she wasn't wrong, how she stayed late to help coworkers who barely remembered her name. She carried pain silently, and yet she gave. At lunch, he followed her again, but this time closer. Emily noticed footsteps behind her and turned, startled. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him. "And Mr. Blackwood?" she stammered, lowering her head immediately. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" The fear in her voice cut deeper than any insult he'd ever received. "No," he said quickly, surprising himself. "You didn't. I was just curious where you go every day." Her hands tightened around the paper bag. I eat outside, sir." He nodded slowly. "May I walk with you?" She froze. Employees didn't walk with Alexander Blackwood. They trembled in front of him. But she nodded. They walked in silence. Every step felt heavier than the last for Emily. She wondered if she was about to lose her job. If someone had complained. If feeding the homeless was somehow against company policy. When they reached the park, she stopped. "I can explain." "I know," Alexander said quietly. She looked up confused. "I've seen you," he continued. "Every day." Her face drained of color. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to use company time." "Why didn't you ever eat?" he asked suddenly. The question stunned her. Emily swallowed hard. "Because they need it more than I do." The disabled man in the wheelchair noticed them. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. Who's he? Emily forced a smile. Just someone from work. Alexander stepped forward, feeling every eye on him. For the first time in his life, he felt out of place, not because he lacked money, but because he lacked humility. "These are your friends?" he asked. Emily nodded. "They're family." Alexander took a deep breath and did something no one had ever seen him do. He knelt. Right there on the dirty pavement, the billionaire CEO knelt and handed out food from her bag. The group stared in shock. "You don't have to," Emily whispered, tears already forming. "I do," he replied softly. As they finished eating, Alexander asked questions. Names. Stories. He listened, really listened, as a former soldier spoke of losing his legs, as a blind woman spoke of losing her son, as Emily spoke of losing everything and choosing kindness anyway. When they finally walked back, Emily couldn't hold it in anymore. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Alexander stopped. The city noise surrounded them, but for a moment, it felt like only the two of them existed. "Because I judged you," he said honestly. "And I was wrong." Her eyes filled with tears. "People judge me every day."
"I know," he said.
"I built my life judging others." The next week, something strange happened. Emily's workload was reduced. Her desk was moved closer to the window. She received a raise notification she thought was a mistake. Then came the envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers. Mandatory meeting with CEO. Her heart sank. She stood outside his office, breathing fast. Inside, Alexander waited. Not as a boss, but as a man burdened by regret. "Come in," he said gently. Emily sat, clutching her bag. "I won't fire you," he said immediately. She exhaled sharply. "I want to support what you're doing," he continued. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I want to fund meals, medical care, shelters, and I want you to lead it." Her mouth fell open. "I'm just an employee," she whispered. "No," Alexander said firmly. "You're the strongest person in this building." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But there's more," he added. He slid a document across the table. A contract. A foundation bearing her brother's name. Emily broke. She stood up, hands shaking, tears falling freely as years of pain, sacrifice, and loneliness crashed out of her heart. "I don't know what to say," she sobbed. Alexander stood too. "Say yes." And in that moment, as she cried not from hunger or loss, but from being seen, Alexander Blackwood understood true wealth for the first time in his life. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the contract resting on her lap like it might vanish if she blinked. The words blurred through her tears. A foundation. Her brother's name. A future she had never allowed herself to imagine. For years, she had trained herself not to hope. Hope was dangerous when life had already taken so much. But now, hope knocked loudly at her door, and she didn't know whether to let it in. Across the city, Alexander Blackwood stood in his penthouse, staring at a photo he hadn't looked at in decades, his younger self beside his father, a man who had taught him one lesson above all else: never be weak. "Kindness is a liability," his father used to say. "If you want to win, close your heart." Alexander had followed that rule his entire life, until Emily Carter broke it without even trying. The next morning, Emily arrived at work early, her eyes tired but determined. Whispers followed her as she walked through the office. "Did you hear?" She met the CEO. Why did her desk move? She kept her head down as always. At 10 sharp, Alexander called a company-wide meeting. The auditorium filled quickly. Employees murmured nervously as Alexander stepped onto the stage. His presence usually meant layoffs, restructuring, or impossible expectations. But today, his voice sounded different. For years, he began, this company has measured success in profit margins and growth charts. We rewarded ambition and ignored humanity. The room fell silent. There is an employee among you who reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. Eyes turned toward Emily as Alexander gestured for her to stand. Her legs felt weak. She slowly rose, her hands shaking. This woman, he continued, spent her lunch breaks feeding the disabled and homeless. Not for praise, not for recognition, but because she refused to turn away from suffering. Emily's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear. She represents the values we should have honored all along. Alexander announced the launch of a company-backed humanitarian foundation, fully funded, with paid volunteer hours for employees and medical support for the disabled community near the city streets. Gasps filled the room. And Emily Carter will lead it. Emily's breath caught. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Later that day, Emily visited the park again, but this time, she wasn't alone. Alexander joined her. Trucks arrived with hot meals, blankets, and medical staff. The disabled men stared in disbelief. "What's all this?" one asked. Emily smiled through tears. "It's just the beginning." Alexander watched her move among them, kneeling, laughing, listening. She hadn't changed. Money hadn't touched her soul. That's when he realized something frightening and beautiful. He didn't just admire her. He respected her. Days turned into weeks. The foundation grew. Stories spread. News outlets called. Donations poured in. Emily tried to refuse the spotlight. "I'm not doing this for attention," she told Alexander. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." One evening, after a long day, Emily stayed late organizing reports. Alexander stopped by her office. "You should go home," he said. She smiled tiredly. "Old habits." He hesitated. "Can I ask you something personal?" She nodded. "After everything you've lost, why didn't you become bitter?" Emily thought for a long moment. "Because bitterness would have taken the last thing I had left," she said softly. "My heart." Something inside Alexander cracked again. He drove her home that night. As she stepped out, she turned back. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the money. For seeing me." He watched her walk away, knowing his life would never return to what it was before. But change still had a price. And not everyone in his world was happy about it. Behind closed doors, board members whispered. Shareholders questioned his decisions. His past began pushing back. And Alexander would soon have to choose between the empire he built with cold hands and the humanity he rediscovered through a woman who fed strangers with empty ones. The backlash came quietly at first. Emails filled Alexander's inbox, polite on the surface, sharp beneath. Board members questioned expenses. Investors asked whether compassion had replaced strategy. Words like emotional decision-making and brand risk appeared again and again. Alexander read every message. For the first time, they didn't scare him. In the office corridors, Emily sensed the tension before anyone spoke of it. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Some smiles felt forced. Others carried jealousy masked as curiosity. One afternoon, a coworker finally whispered, "You're lucky he noticed you." Emily smiled gently. Luck had nothing to do with it. That same evening, Alexander called an emergency board meeting. The room was cold, polished, and intimidating, designed to crush doubt. 12 powerful men sat around the table, eyes sharp, suits flawless. "This foundation is costing millions," one director said bluntly. "Our shareholders didn't invest in charity." Alexander folded his hands calmly. "They invested in leadership." Another scoffed. You're letting a junior employee influence company policy. Alexander's jaw tightened. She influenced my humanity. Silence fell. You built this empire by being ruthless, a third voice said. Don't ruin it now. Alexander stood. I didn't build it alone, he said firmly. Thousands of employees did. And I failed them by teaching them that profit matters more than people. He slid a document across the table. I'm restructuring executive bonuses. A portion will fund the foundation permanently. Outrage erupted. This is madness. No, Alexander replied quietly. This is responsibility. That night, Emily sat alone in the park long after the others had left. She watched the disabled man in the wheelchair struggle with a loose blanket and rushed to help him. You look worried, he said. She smiled weakly. Just tired. He studied her. That man with the suit, he's fighting battles for you. Emily looked down. I never wanted to cause trouble. The man squeezed her hand. Kindness always causes trouble. For the right people. The next morning, Emily was called into HR. Her hands trembled as she walked down the hallway. Old fears resurfaced. This world had never been kind to people like her. Inside the room sat Alexander. HR wasn't there. Sit, he said gently. Her voice shook. Am I in trouble? He exhaled slowly. Some people want the foundation shut down. Her face fell. But they won't win, he continued. Even if it costs me my position. Tears welled in her eyes. I never asked you to risk everything. I know, he said. That's why I choose to. For the first time, Emily spoke without holding back. Do you know what it's like to be invisible? She asked quietly. To give everything you have and still be ignored? Alexander nodded. I made people invisible for a living. She stood, tears streaming. Please don't lose everything because of me. He stood too. Emily, you didn't take anything from me. You gave me something I lost. News broke 2 days later. Alexander Blackwood resigned as CEO. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire steps down after emotional decision. Corporate giant loses its edge. Emily read the news in shock.
Her phone rang.
I'm so sorry, she cried when he answered. I'm not, he said calmly. For the first time, I'm proud. The board appointed a new CEO, but Alexander retained majority ownership. And then, quietly, he made his next move. He transferred a massive portion of his personal wealth into the foundation. Emily collapsed into a chair when she found out, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't accept this, she whispered. Alexander knelt in front of her. You already did, he said. Every time you fed someone instead of yourself. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside that small office, 2 broken lives were rebuilding something far bigger than money. And the world was about to witness the true impact of one poor woman's kindness and one billionaire's transformation. The city didn't notice the change at first. Traffic still roared. People still rushed past one another with eyes glued to screens and minds locked on survival. But in the forgotten corners of the streets, something new was growing. Quietly, steadily, because 2 very different souls had chosen compassion over comfort. The foundation expanded faster than anyone expected. Mobile kitchens lined the streets. Medical vans treated the disabled and homeless with dignity. Shelters opened their doors, not just offering beds, but offering names, conversations, and respect. For the first time in years, people who had been invisible felt seen. And at the center of it all stood Emily. Not as a hero, but as herself.
She still wore simple clothes.
Still packed food with her own hands. Still knelt beside wheelchairs and listened to stories without checking the time. Cameras tried to follow her. She gently turned them away.
This isn't about me, she always said.
It's about them. Alexander watched from a distance. No suits. No security. Just a man learning how to exist without hiding behind power. One evening, as the sun painted the sky gold, Emily sat beside the blind woman who had become like a grandmother to her. "You cry less now," the woman said softly. Emily smiled through wet eyes. "Because I'm not alone anymore." Alexander approached slowly.
Can I sit? He asked.
Emily nodded. They watched people eat, laugh, and talk, something that once felt impossible. "I used to think money was proof of worth," Alexander said quietly. "Now I know it's only a tool." Emily looked at him. "You didn't just give money. You gave trust." He shook his head. "You gave me back my soul." A young boy approached them, holding a sandwich in shaky hands. "Mister, thank you for the food." Alexander swallowed hard. "You're welcome." The boy turned to Emily. "She's the reason we're here." Emily's eyes filled. Later that night, as the streets emptied, Emily finally broke down. Years of hunger. Years of loss. Years of being unseen. She collapsed into tears, her body shaking as everything she had held inside came rushing out. Alexander didn't speak. He simply stayed. When she finally looked up, her voice cracked. "Why me?" He answered without hesitation. "Because the world changes when the kindest people stop suffering in silence." Months later, a plaque was placed near the park. Not with Alexander's name, not with a company logo, but with a simple message. True wealth is measured by how many lives you lift when you have the chance. Emily touched the words and smiled through tears. She never became rich, but she became powerful in the only way that mattered. And Alexander Blackwood, once feared, once cold, finally understood that compassion is the only legacy that survives us. Because in the end, the act that changed everything wasn't made in a boardroom. It was made during a lunch break, with an empty stomach and a full heart. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness carry the greatest power. A simple meal, a listening ear, a heart that refuses to look away. This story reminds us that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts or tall buildings. It's found in compassion, in humanity, and in choosing to care when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be heard. And remember, the world doesn't change because of powerful people. It changes because of kind ones. Red Heart.